Welcome, fellow followers of the Undying Glow, to the first video examining the miscellaneous energy weapons that don't fit neatly within the categories of laser or plasma. We have Gauss weapons, pulse weapons, and a few special ones in between. So if you wanted to know about the lore of the weapons, how they are used in-game, background information, and how these Fallout weapons work in the real world, this is the video for you. Turn up the rads and grab some fancy lads because we are talking about some Fallout energy weapons. Remember to stick around after the list for the comment highlight and a small announcement for those that need a little more Rad King in their lives. On to the video. You know you're in the end game when you are finally able to equip the mighty Gauss rifle. Although this is not always considered an energy weapon in all the games, since it doesn't fit nicely in with the conventional rifles, this is where we're going to talk about it. First appearing in Fallout 2, this is one of the best weapons in the whole game, and definitely the best of all the small guns. The in-game description states that the weapon is of German design, and the M72, as it's officially known, is said to be unparalleled in range, accuracy, and penetration, which is definitely represented by the in-game performance. Landing shots between 32 and 43 damage against even heavily armored targets, it has the highest range amongst all weapons, tied with the Gauss pistol and sniper rifle, and has excellent armor penetration. That armor penetration, paired with an increased critical shot when aiming for the eyes of an enemy, can cause this weapon to completely ignore damage resistance of even the most heavily armored enemies. Weighing 10 pounds, firing 20 rounds per magazine, and with an AP cost of only 5, is this the perfect weapon? Is this it? Is it all downhill from here? Well, one of the few true weaknesses of this beautiful example of German engineering is not the gun itself, but how expensive and difficult it is to get the 2mm EC ammunition. Usually only found in the NCR Bazaar Weapon Shop, San Francisco, and the Enclave Oil Rig, the lack of ammunition is the only real limiting factor in its use. The low amount of ammunition and the expensive weapon and ammo type makes sense given how powerful and advanced this weapon is. But what makes the Gauss rifle so powerful? Especially when considering the ammunition used is only 2mm in diameter. It all comes down to the insane ballistic velocities that the ammunition is able to achieve through electromagnetic acceleration. The Gauss rifle, otherwise known as a coil gun, operates by using a series of electromagnets to send a ferromagnetic projectile down the barrel. The electromagnets are powered in a timed sequence, pulling the projectile to the center of the electromagnet before powering off as to not slow down the projectile. The next electromagnet in sequence will power on, pulling the projectile toward it, and this process continues until it reaches the end and exits the barrel. So while not being powered by expanding gases like conventional firearms, it also means that the more powerful the electromagnets, the faster the projectile velocity, as long as there's enough power to power the magnets. The M72 is next seen in Fallout Tactics, where it is shown in much the same form, just slightly higher resolution and fidelity, so some of the details are easier to make out. The magazine is a lot more recognizable as it angles out and honestly looks a lot like a conventional firearm magazine. Other than that, it has the same description as the Fallout 2 gun and has similar stellar performance, and the highest range and some of the best damage and penetration of all weapons. One interesting twist though is that while it has an extra bonus for long-range aimed shots, it actually has a penalty for close-ranged aim shots, which incentivizes longer-range shooting. The Fallout 2 variant didn't have any penalties for close range, meaning that it could be used in any scenario without much consideration. The 2mm EC rounds are pretty interesting to think about, since I previously thought about the 5mm ammo used in the minigun, and how I consider that to already be super tiny. For reference, a common 22 round is around 5.58mm in diameter, with 2mm coming in at a ridiculously small 0.07 inch diameter. We don't necessarily know the length, and to use common ammunition terminology, the grain of the bullet, which roughly corresponds to its mass. For all we know, they may have a small diameter but have a lot more length, making them similar to a modern sabot round that are used by many tanks. There is no lore necessarily to support that, and it is merely a suggestion based on the small diameter of the rounds and the insane penetration capabilities. I also think that the rounds probably have more mass than we think given their small diameter, since there are some issues with them being accelerated to blistering speeds and being so small. One is that the extremely high speeds would no doubt cause massive friction and therefore heat on the round, which would no doubt cause them to lose a little bit of mass as they fly towards their target. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but the weapon is more effective when the bullets don't burn up before they hit the enemy. The second important point is that if they are too light, then they will not preserve momentum particularly well, and their velocity would drastically drop off with distance, making it no more effective or possibly even less effective than conventional firearms at long range. So while there is nothing in the lore that states this, I think it is possible that the rounds, although small in diameter, are probably quite long. I think it is fair to assume as well that the energy to fire the bullet is contained within the 2mm EC round itself, but the images from Fallout 2 and Fallout Tactics don't give us much to go on. Perhaps it is one magazine-like unit where some futuristic capacitors or battery holds a charge for a number of ferromagnetic rounds that are contained within it, and it has just enough juice to fire all of those internal rounds. Honestly, there's not much to go off of based on the images and the in-game information, so I'd be interested in your thoughts on how this ammunition type works. As far as what EC stands for, your guess is as good as mine. I could see it being energy cell or electromagnetic cartridge, but if you have a better suggestion for what EC stands for, I'd also like to hear about that. Looking at the design, it definitely looks futuristic, and the circular objects down the barrel are definitely the electromagnets. I actually like the wooden furniture on it as well, since it seems to combine with the ultra-futuristic look with an older aesthetic, reminding me of many firearms that commonly used wooden furniture before largely switching over to composites in the latter half of the 20th century. While I can't pinpoint a design inspiration, apparently the Stalker games introduced the Gauss rifle in their games due to inspiration from Fallout. The next time we see a Gauss rifle is in Fallout 3, although it does not look much like the previous M72, implying that this is a different gun altogether. Being introduced in the Fallout Anchorage add-on, it still carries some of the impressive capabilities that we have come to expect of the Gauss rifle, but also some serious limitations. It is first available in the simulation where the player can equip it from a dead US paratrooper and is taken from the player's inventory after the completion of the first mission. Once the simulation is complete, the player is able to take the Gauss rifle from the armory along with a slew of other items, and it is the only one available in the whole game. Due to that, it can only be repaired with merchants, which gets pretty expensive, or by using the alien epoxy from the Mothership Zeta add-on. One cool new ability the Gauss rifle gets in Fallout 3 is the ability to knock down enemies on critical hits for 4 seconds, which can really come in handy when fighting some of the Wasteland's most damaging and bullet-spongy enemies. At 100 damage per shot, it sits at the top of the energy weapons as far as damage goes, which, oh yeah, I forgot to mention that it is now considered an energy weapon, which I don't necessarily agree with, but for that reason, it is here in this list of miscellaneous energy weapons. At 100 damage would be more impressive if it could fire more quickly, but gone are the days of having multiple rounds in a single clip or magazine, since it can only fire once before needing to be reloaded. Due to that, it is really only feasible long range and sometimes as a mid-range weapon, and that coupled with the higher than average critical chance and high critical damage makes for an excellent long-ranged weapon that suffers in close combat. I find this interesting for a few reasons. One, it is another indication that this rifle was developed entirely separately from the M72 from previous games, possibly being an American attempt to replicate the German M72. The second reason is that microfusion cells only provide power, like in the case of laser weapons, and therefore the projectiles must come from somewhere else. There is a large rectangular magazine that juts out on the right side where the ammo is presumably stored. That magazine is never reloaded at any time. So maybe like previous weapons that we never see get reloaded, the ammunition is replaced and topped off when the weapon is repaired. It has fewer than 400 shots before needing to be repaired, and perhaps part of that process is reloading the projectiles. We actually don't know the size of the projectiles that is fired in this version of the Gauss rifle, but I think we can reasonably assume that they are small diameter like the M72, and the deep magazine could indicate that the projectiles are also kind of long. There are only 2 other versions, if you want to call them that, and that is the so-called slim version, which is almost exactly the same, with the most notable difference being that it has so much HP it is effectively invincible. It is the version used in the Operation Anchorage simulation where they didn't want deterioration as a mechanic. The second version is the Beta Gauss rifle, which has the appearance of a normal laser rifle, has a 5-round magazine, and lower overall stats. It appears Bethesda went for the more specialized approach with 1 shot per reload, but really high damage, which I think was a good call to keep the weapon from being too powerful. Some interesting notes are that companions and other NPCs are not able to equip the Gauss rifle, but they can use the slim version if it is obtained with console commands. The Gauss rifle is also one of the only energy weapons that does not reduce enemies to ashes when they get killed on a critical hit, which makes sense since it is not a direct energy weapon. Lastly, an interesting note is that Chinese posters in Operation Anchorage show Chinese soldiers equipped with Gauss rifles, which could indicate that the weapon is of Chinese design, or what I think is more likely, the simulation had a mistake, which we've come to kind of expect of the simulation. This representation of the Gauss rifle was also used in Fallout New Vegas, where it is still a rare weapon to find, although it can be found in places like the Brotherhood of Steel bunker and on some corpses in Lonesome Road. It still has high damage and slow reload, being fairly comparable to the anti-material rifle in function, where it has a slower rate of fire but is lighter and has higher critical chance. One big difference between the Fallout New Vegas version and the Fallout 3 version are that the New Vegas versions take 5 microfusion cells per shot rather than just 1, and it no longer has the knockdown effect on critical shots. The in-game model is almost identical except for the addition of a pad on the stock or some sort of extension. The YCS-186 is the only available in-game variant of the Gauss rifle in New Vegas and looks the same, except for some coloration changes that could be rust, but it is kind of hard to tell. This variant uses 4 microfusion cells instead of 5, has more HP than the standard Gauss rifle, and is slightly more accurate for only being a little bit heavier. It is obtained from a mercenary camp east of Brooks Tumbleweed Ranch, where a heavily armored mercenary will engage the player on sight. We are not given any more information regarding its origins, but apparently the variant's name of YCS-186 stands for Your Console Sucks from the Something Awful forums, and the 186 number is the number of that specific forum. So there's definitely a fan of Something Awful amongst the developers at Obsidian. Father Elijah uses a non-playable version that has increased damage output based on the player's level, topping out at a whopping 208 damage. The so-called Faderator is a version that is only obtainable via console commands and looks identical to the vanilla Gauss rifle. It was a debug weapon, likely used to help playtesters get through combat quickly as it has an effective DPS of 20,160. It shoots a spread of 3 shots per trigger pull, is automatic, uses less ammunition, which honestly is not a big deal because it actually uses no ammunition at all, has a higher VATS critical chance, and a ton of knockback. It is interesting to note that each DLC has its own version of the Faderator, so if you want to take all the fun out of New Vegas, you know exactly what gun to go for. Looking at the weapon itself, it is noticeably different from the M72 but has some similar design elements, most notably the exposed electromagnets on the barrel and wooden furniture. The magazine is no longer located under the weapon and the power source is separate from the projectiles, with 1 or more microfusion cells being loaded into the side for each shot. This also means that it can only fire once before needing to have the microfusion cell swapped out, which drastically reduces the rate of fire. The weapon has a large scope now, as well as what looks like a muzzle brake at the end of the barrel. That is an interesting addition since that is a common element on conventional firearms, to direct some expanding gases perpendicular to the barrel and lessening overall recoil. The last element worth noting is a large, what appears to be a crank that is never used in-game, so its function remains mysterious. I would love to hear some of your speculation on what this crank could be used for, as it doesn't seem to be important to firing or reloading since the player character never uses it. Fallout 4, once again, features the Gauss rifle, and once again, the design completely changes. And with that comes some functional changes as well. The Fallout 4 version looks less refined, like it is a prototype or testbed of some sort. There's not much in the way of user-friendly features like a dedicated front grip or a sight rail of any sort. It has just the bare minimum in terms of a wooden pistol grip and stock. The electromagnets are as exposed as ever, even showing off their copper coils, and the weapon changes back to 2mm EC ammo, instead of just using microfusion cells like the Fallout 3 and New Vegas version. These round drum-like ammunition containers seem to hold both the electrical charge needed to fire the weapon and the projectiles, and is inserted on the top of the gun. I'm glad they went back to the 2mm EC ammo, since it makes more sense to have an ammo type that bundles the electricity and projectile together that are needed to fire the weapon. This bulky looking weapon can have a number of upgrades thanks to the Fallout 4 crafting system, and while most of these are different kinds of sights, there are a few that boost damage, like the shielded barrel and capacitor boosting coils. One of particular note is the suppressor, which does what one thinks a suppressor would do, only I think it's notable because of how absurdly long and bulky it makes the weapon, which is already pretty bulky. I have a hard time believing anyone could hold that thing steady enough when standing to hit anything at a distance. The Gauss rifle stands as one of the most potent weapons on a per shot basis, and the Fallout 4 version has a charging mechanic as well. Holding the fire button can cause the weapon to charge the capacitors, and when fully charged, will fire the weapon with much greater velocity, resulting in increased damage. It also recovered the ability from Fallout 3 to cause a small explosion on impact that can deal splash damage to surrounding enemies. All of that, and it still manages to fire more than one round per reload, which is a lot better than the Fallout 3 and New Vegas era Gauss rifles. The Gauss rifle is no longer considered an energy weapon, which I think is the right call. So benefits from the Rifleman perk, and when fully upgraded and supported by all the possible perks, this weapon is only behind the Fat Man in pure damage per shot output, even beating out the 6-crank laser musket. There is one variant, known as the Last Minute, which has a few upgrades like the suppressor and shielded barrel, while coming with the crippling legendary effect, which causes 50% more damage to limbs. Some interesting tidbits about the Fallout 4 version are that when firing from VATS, it will fire fully charged shots, and upgrading the Rifleman perk to level 5 can cause the Gauss rifle to be powerful enough to break most pieces of power armor with only one shot, save for the torso. The in-game representation of the projectile is actually larger than other ballistic weapons, which is pretty funny because the 2mm diameter ammunition would be minuscule compared to anything else. Lastly, remember to not equip your companions with this weapon because their rates of fire is severely diminished, likely due to them charging every round and causing them to not fire at targets very quickly. This version of the Gauss rifle also shows up in the same form and largely the same function in Fallout 76, having a slightly smaller clip size, but now the explosion from the round is impacted by the demolition perk, so leveling up that perk can result in higher damaging contact explosions. The upgrades are also a bit different, with upgrades such as quick capacitors, piercing capacitors, stinging capacitors, and prime capacitors. I am beginning to think Bethesda has no idea how capacitors work exactly. There's one cut variant known as the Presidential Gauss Rifle, which has a pretty epic color scheme, sporting a lot of red, white, and blue paint, stars, and a modified US flag along the barrel. Although this was seen in promotional material for the One Wasteland for All event, it was actually never implemented in-game. Overall, I like the looks of this weapon, but I'm really curious as to how all these variants work in terms of Fallout's lore. This version of the Gauss rifle does not look like a production version. The electronics look far too exposed to be used by soldiers on the front lines, so intuitively I would think that this might be the oldest of all the models, or at least America's first attempt at replicating the high-tech German M72. This is all thrown into question though by the Creation Club edition of the so-called prototype Gauss rifle, which is an exact representation of the Fallout 3 and New Vegas era Gauss rifle. So, to make any sense of all these different variants, the M72 is a German invention that may have been used by elements of the military, hence its presence on the West Coast. The United States may have tried to create their own Gauss rifle, which resulted in the Fallout 3 and New Vegas era weapons that is said to be used by military forces based on the cover of an issue of Guns and Bullets magazine. That may not imply that it was being actively used, rather showing off a new weapon that was soon to be used in active combat, similar to how magazines like Popular Mechanics will feature a new future weapon that is supposed to be implemented soon. That would mean that the Fallout 4 version would make the most sense as a post-war invention due to the lack of refinement. But the inclusion of Fallout 76, which takes place so close after the events of the Great War, would seem to contradict that point. Whoever can make the most sense out of all of these variants will be featured in my next comment highlight, so let's hear it. I also just have to say I love that this gun has some Nixie tubes on the back as a display. I need more Nixie tubes on my weapons, Bethesda. Thank you. Let's run with the Gauss theme and talk about the Fallout 76 exclusive, the Gauss shotgun. This large weapon is not a big gun, it is classified as an energy weapon. Which is funny because the series can never seem to decide how it wants to classify its Gauss weapons. In Fallout and Fallout 2 it wasn't an energy weapon, in Fallout 3 and New Vegas it was, and in Fallout 4 and 76 it is not anymore except for the Gauss shotgun. However, even that is not exactly right, because rather than firing multiple small projectiles from one barrel like shotguns are built to do, it instead fires one round from multiple barrels all at the same time. That does not make it a shotgun, but more like some sort of volley gun, and would make the weapon even more ridiculously energy hungry and heavy, since the multiple projectiles would need to be accelerated at the same time. It can still be charged for extra damage and has explosive effects for each projectile, which makes it a very potent weapon since the damage per projectile is already very high. But the use of the rare 2mm EC ammunition means that it is a difficult beast to keep going for long. The mods that can be done all impact the receiver, which increases damage output, or allow it to shoot ultrasight ammo, but that's about it. The design looks much more refined than the Gauss rifle, although the stock and trigger look like they may have been strapped to the rest of the gun as more of an afterthought rather than being part of an original design. Sadly, there's no other information to go off of for this weapon, but I like seeing more Gauss weaponry being introduced in the game, so I hope that this is a trend that will continue. Fallout introduced the Gauss rifle, but also the little brother, the Gauss pistol. Known in-game as the PPK-12 Gauss pistol, it does a lot of damage and has a 12-round magazine, while also having great range and good AP use. With the right perks like fast shot and bonus rate of fire, it can have the best AP cost to damage ratio of all single shot guns in the whole game. So, similar to the Gauss rifle, there are really no downsides to this weapon, other than the difficult to come by 2mm EC ammo that is used, just like the bigger Gauss rifle. From a design perspective, it is obvious that whoever made the Gauss rifle also made the Gauss pistol, and I find the naming convention of the weapon very peculiar. The PP prefix makes me think of Walter, or Walter, a German weapons manufacturer that has been making weapons since the 1930s. Since Fallout and Fallout 2 have a proclivity to give historic weapons manufacturers like Heckler & Koch and Remington super futuristic weapons in the Fallout timeline, I think it is probable that these Gauss weapons were made by Walter. This pistol is shown in Fallout Tactics, although it doesn't use the Fallout 2 description, which the game, more often than not, tends to do, even when it doesn't really make sense. Tactics claims that the pistol is a modified version of the Gauss rifle, likely meaning that the Gauss rifle was created first, and then they moved to try and miniaturize the technology, which resulted in the PPK-12. In a super interesting twist, Tactics is not the last time we see the PPK-12, as it skips several games and shows up in Fallout 76 in a modified form. It doesn't look much like the original PPK-12 from the earlier games. It lacks the easily identifiable electromagnets, but can still be charged for extra damage and does explosive damage when firing on targets. It can accept a number of modifications, increasing damage, managing recoil, increasing mag size, and mount sights. While not quite as strong as in Fallout 2 and Tactics, it is still one of the best pistols in the whole game. Fallout 2 gives us an odd little weapon known in-game as the YK-32 Pulse Pistol, and it looks just as futuristic as it sounds. Having been developed by the Yuma Flats Energy Consortium, it fires what is just called an electrical pulse to pretty great effect on target with an absolutely epic critical hit animation. That is definitely one of my favorites right there. Using small energy cells to fire, this weapon does a very respectable amount of damage, and due to that is usually seen and used in the Fallout 2 endgame. It can be looted from the Brotherhood of Steel bunker in San Francisco, or can be found on Enclave units in the area around Navarro, where the Enclave scout patrols are commonly encountered. Dealing electrical damage, it has the added bonus of having fantastic penetration, benefiting from the weapon penetration perk, and is able to bypass the damage resistance of most armors. With all those great benefits, there do come a few drawbacks. First, the ammo capacity is low and the weapon must be reloaded after 5 shots, which can be problematic in a prolonged fight. The biggest problem though is the really abysmal effective range, meaning that this is really only a good option when up close and personal with the enemy. Taking a look at the gun, it looks very much like the kinds of ray guns that were popular as toys or in sci-fi during the 1950s and 60s, such as this new age smoke ring ray gun. We see this weapon next in Fallout Tactics, where it looks largely the same, although it looks a lot cleaner and with more vibrant colors, which I don't really like as much if I'm being honest. It still does electrical type damage, does an impressive amount of damage, and has lower range than most other weapons, mirroring how the weapon works in Fallout 2. It is found in some Brotherhood bunkers, and there is a post-war prototype that I will discuss in the next section. We are not given any other information about this weapon, but it is interesting to think about how exactly this gun functions. When thinking about what a pulse weapon is and how it works, we can infer that it is shooting some sort of electromagnetic wave, since it deals electrical damage, and that is the only way I can make sense of the so-called pulse. The in-game firing animation shows a quick blue object being fired by the pulse gun, so if it is an EM ray, we would need to ask, what kind of EM ray would it be firing? Well, depending on the frequency of the wave, there are a number of ways to transform the wave energy into actual electrical current. However, this is really only possible by using specialized antennas or some other type of object that can absorb the wave and transfer it into electricity. Simply firing an assortment of EM waves at a human body will induce a number of different effects, everything from essentially nothing from radio waves, to potentially building up heat with microwaves, to blasting the body with visible light and heat with visible light, and potentially causing DNA damage for the more energetic ionizing radiation that comes after visible light. No frequency within that spectrum will just electrocute you, unless you had specialized items to transform the wave into electricity. Another option could be the theoretical particle beam, which is sometimes referred to as a ray, where a high concentration of neutral particles are fired towards an object. While this is still an area of active development with militaries around the world, it has not yielded a whole lot, and the end result seems to be increasing temperature rather than inducing a current. Maybe they have found a way to fire charged particles instead of neutral particles, which modern technology has struggled to do, since particles of the same charge will repel each other and will not form concentrated beams. If you have an idea as to how this weapon functions that isn't just funky Fallout science, then leave a comment. The big brother of the pulse pistol is the pulse rifle, firing an electrical pulse, but this time being powered by microfusion cells. The more potent energy source is meant to feed the hungrier pulse rifle that deals around 20 more damage per shot. The rifle truly outclasses the pistol in almost every way. It doubles the range of the pistol, does more damage, and it has double the capacity for only one more action point per shot. It is still not as good at long-range firing as the other weapons, and suffers from low critical chance at range, and is also very hard to get and extremely expensive. It is actually the most expensive weapon in the game, being available for only 17,500 caps, but is also one of the highest damaging weapons in the whole game due to its armor penetration ability. Although not great against floaters since they have natural electrical resistance, this weapon and the Alien Blaster are two of the best weapons that can be used against Frank Horrigan because he has a weakness to electrical damage. Fallout Tactics is the only other game with a pulse rifle that looks exactly like the Fallout 2 weapon and operates very similarly. It is not a common weapon and can be found in Vault Zero or being used by the Brotherhood of Steel member known as Phoenix. Interestingly, there is a prototype rifle that was being developed post-war by the Reaver faction and offered to the Brotherhood of Steel for help in rescuing some of their members. This prototype is a bit more plain and most notably is wired up to the energy source that hangs off the weapon for some reason. The odd thing about this prototype is that it is inferior to the normal pulse rifle in almost every way, doing less damage and having less firing capacity. The only benefit is that it has a lower strength requirement, and maybe this is tied to the more stripped down design that doesn't have some of the same components as the original, and seems to have the energy source not connected to the gun, and would likely be attached to the user somewhere else on their body. The design of the pulse rifle definitely looks to be in the same vein as the pulse pistol, being a great example of the design philosophy of 50s and 60s sci-fi ray guns. I have to point out something that I think is really funny though, and that is the stock. I'm not sure what the heck is going on with that thing. It honestly looks like it was tacked on hastily with some spare pieces of metal because it does not adhere to the overall theme of the weapon at all. Otherwise, this and the pistol really seem to fit well into the Fallout aesthetic, and I would love to see them make their way back into the newer Fallout games. Fallout New Vegas is the only 3D Fallout game that features a pulse weapon, and it is known simply as the pulse gun. It looks different from the previous pulse weaponry, although it is still inspired by ray gun designs, and the art of New Vegas even shows an example ray gun that the design used as inspiration. If you know what this specific ray gun toy is, let me know, because the reverse Google image search didn't get me anywhere. This weapon looks similar to the sonic emitters that were introduced in the Old World Blues add-on. However, the pulse gun cannot be found anywhere in the Big MT and is only found in the Vault 34 Armory, which was equipped with a massive amount of weaponry as part of the social experiment. It also used to be rarely found on Fiends and could be bought at the Silver Rush before a patch removed these options. We have no information on the background of this particular weapon, although it's obvious it is pre-war in origin since it is found locked in the Vault 34 Armory, but there is no mention of the Yuma Mountain Energy Consortium that made the other weapons. This pulse gun takes more of the ambiguity out of the kind of energy that it shoots, since while it does very little damage to average enemies, it has a massive 250 damage boost to robots and 110 to power armored enemies. That means it is very obviously firing an electromagnetic pulse due to the serious damage it is able to do to enemies that are electronic or rely on electronic systems, making this a true pulse weapon. Using energy cells, this weapon is highly specialized and should be stowed away and only pulled out when facing robotic or power armored opponents. Be mindful, however, since it won't be effective against heavy NCR troopers who use servoless power armor, and similarly the think tank bots have built-in resistance to EMPs and will not be damaged significantly by the pulse gun. So since there's an obvious design relationship between the pulse gun and the sonic emitters, we may assume that the pulse gun was created by Big Mountain prior to the Great War, and the pulse design was used in the creation of the sonic emitters. However, no pulse guns can be found anywhere at Big Mountain, so perhaps it was created by some unknown entity and the think tank co-opted the design in their own work on sonic emitters. The Spasm gun is a Fallout Tactics special that was made with a specific use case in mind. According to the in-game description, its intended use is to overload the synapses of the target, causing sensory overload and jerking motions associated with motor control loss. These side effects are listed as memory loss, brain damage, motor control deterioration, and hemorrhaging, along with a slight stunning effect. This weapon was only available in multiplayer mode, and the full name was the Spasm Neuro Disruptor. This energy weapon has an okay range and pretty middling damage at a max of 24, but the 3 AP cost lets it be used many more times in battle. The gun itself is a bit nondescript, although it has a stock that is likely more for steadying the weapon and controlling it than actually dealing with any recoil. Similarly, there's an open barrel, which is a bit different for a lot of these kinds of energy weapons, which usually have some sort of dish or antenna kind of barrel. While strictly speaking, we don't have a weapon that can have this same effect, research has shown that electrical fields can have an effect on neurons, causing them to fire when they otherwise wouldn't. So it is possible that this gun works on a similar principle, creating an electrical field in the direction that is fired that causes neurons to start firing at random, causing the aforementioned effects to occur. It is well known that the effects similar to what is stated in the game occur to those that have overstimulated neurons, like in the case of a seizure or under the influence of some drugs. I think this is a pretty cool gun, and it would be fun to have a class of weapons that affects the biomechanics or bioelectrics of targets, causing them to act erratically for a bit of time, and even having its own unique critical death animation, like massive hemorrhaging from the head area, or even the good old Bethesda head explosion. Fallout 4 introduced a unique weapon that used a reworked mechanic that finally made radiation weaponry viable. The Gamma Gun is unique in almost every way, from its aesthetics, to who usually wields it, to the firing animations and ammo. The Gamma Gun is not an elegant weapon by any means. Everything looks crudely made and bolted on or stapled together. There's no lore behind the origins of the weapon, but based purely on the aesthetics, I think it is reasonable to assume it is a post-war creation. This fires the newly introduced Gamma round, which really limits this weapon's use since it is not as commonly found as small energy cells or microfusion cells. The rounds themselves resemble electrolytic capacitors, connecting to the weapon by just 2 contact points, and you can see green electricity sparking beneath the Gamma rounds when installed on the gun. The reloading animation does not give me much confidence in the robustness of this weapon, as the player one by one inserts 3 Gamma rounds on top of the weapon, simply pushing the 2 exposed terminal leads into a rounded slot. When reloading, the green electricity seen under the Gamma rounds will change to a burning yellow-red, and the player then taps the weapon as the Gamma rounds fall off the gun. The loading and reloading animation is very unique and interesting, although it would not be practical in any sense of the term. Gamma rounds were probably introduced in order to limit how much the weapon can be used in game, since Gamma rounds are more rare than other weapon types. But I also like to try and think of in-game reasons why these are used instead of the more common energy weapon ammunition types. It is likely that the rounds either provide more than just electricity, given the green sparks underneath the rounds, and the fact that if all the gun needed was electricity, a microfusion cell or small energy cell would perfectly suffice. So I think there is something extra that these rounds are providing that are required for the weapon to work as intended. The Gamma gun fires bolts or waves of ionizing radiation that drenches a target in radiation, which up until the mechanics change in Fallout 4 wouldn't have been nearly as lethal. In previous games, increased rad count would have various negative effects on the player. Reducing special stats and healing factors was the main consequence of previous games, with the player dying if they maxed out their radiation limits. However, Fallout 4 made a change which I think makes things more interesting. as your health bar will get reduced as you get more irradiated. As the red bar advances to the left, the max HP of the player is equal to the difference between the HP and level of radiation. And if you let the radiation meter advance all the way to the left, you die. This is a more immediate effect than previous radiation mechanics, since a firefight can turn deadly quickly, because you can easily become a one-shot when radiation is capping your max HP. The bolts or waves of energy are some of the most visible in the whole game, having a green color and exploding or rapidly reflecting and dissipating when it hits an object. We can assume the weapon generates gamma radiation, or perhaps a mix of different wavelengths with the primary wave being gamma. The visible bolt of energy that is fired is either for gameplay reasons, so that there's some sort of feedback or indication of where the weapon is firing, or it plays into the 60s sci-fi of things just working differently because, you know, reasons. Or why not both, I guess. Now, the way the weapon inflicts damage is actually not as straightforward as one would think. There are two mechanics at play here. One is radiation poisoning, that is the mechanic we are all used to when the player gets irradiated. A bolt of radiation from the gamma gun causes about 100 rads of radiation poisoning, while also dealing what we have come to call radiation damage. While there are many enemy types that are immune to radiation like ghouls and super mutants, or have heavy radiation resistance like robots, things get a little more complicated. The reason it is all more complicated is the radiation damage affects targets the same, regardless of radiation resistance, because the radiation resistance only applies to the radiation poisoning and not the radiation damage. So you will do damage to enemies even if they have radiation immunity or heavy resistance. But ghouls are kind of special. The relatively small amount of energy damage is not enough to overcome the healing factor from the radiation that ghouls benefit from, meaning that you cannot kill them with a gamma gun. You essentially have a ghoul healing gun in your pocket. Now, only if they would appreciate my efforts to heal them by not hurling their bodies towards me and mauling me to death. I do find the robot resistance to radiation interesting because it has been proven that electronics fail easily in the presence of intense radiation. However, maybe this is justified by saying that Fallout robots were built to resist radiation better than real-world electronics. It is also worth noting that the small area of effect damage is actually considered a type of explosive damage and is therefore increased by the demolition perk. The gamma gun is found almost exclusively amongst the children of Adam, and although we don't know the origin of the weapon, I think it would be reasonable to assume that it was an invention of a child of Adam, no doubt given to them in a revelation from the almighty Adam. It can accept a few modifications to the dish that increase damage and range, the grip for recoil and the so-called muzzle, which can improve the rate of fire and also change the function of the weapon. The electrical signal carrier will allow the user to charge the weapon for extra electrical damage to the target. The gamma gun has an area of effect mechanics so targets can be irradiated on indirect hits as well, and there is a very slight knockback effect that can slightly stun enemies. There are two unique versions of the gamma gun, the Zeta gun and Lorenzo's artifact gun. Lorenzo's artifact gun is the reward for ending the Secret of Cabot House quest in favor of Jack. Upon killing Lorenzo, Jack will use the artifact that gave Lorenzo his incredible powers to make a unique gamma gun, where the artifact is secured to the front of the gamma gun dish. The artifact gun will do some radiation damage, although not as much as the pure gamma gun, but does explosive damage and energy damage with every shot. It also has a much larger knockback effect that can send things flying and knock enemies around with each hit. This makes this weapon one of the most versatile since it can do so many different types of damage. Energy, radiation, and explosive all in one little package. There are some hints that the weapon that was initially planned as the artifact gun was meant to be a laser weapon, since Jack still has lines mentioning that this weapon he fashioned from the artifact is a laser weapon that can be powered by normal microfusion cells. Additionally, there is dialogue when Jack gives you the weapon that it cannot actually harm humans, which is obviously false, as this is one of the most chaotic weapons you can use in the whole game. I think it is likely that this line was meant for the other version of the gamma gun that we also get from Jack, or in his lab known as the Zeta gun. The Zeta gun looks exactly like the gamma gun but has been modified to fire this new kind of radiation, Zeta radiation. Firing a red bolt of radiation instead of the normal green, it is also much weaker than both the gamma gun and Lorenzo's artifact gun, dealing only 10 rads on a direct hit, and similarly low splash damage. This is most likely due to the fact that Jack Cabot explains that Zeta radiation is harmless to humans, which is obviously not true again since the gun does at least some damage, However, the damage is so low as to be effectively useless. Jack had been developing the weapon because his research had shown that the Zeta radiation was effective in weakening and therefore containing his father Lorenzo. So it was actually meant as a specialized weapon to contain his father or fight back against his father should Lorenzo get out. Otherwise, this is a unique little trinket that is best kept in a display case. The gamma radiation in Fallout 76 looks the same and has the same mods, only changing the mechanics a little bit. Radiation damage no longer seems to be in effect, so enemy types with radiation immunity will not take damage from this weapon, like super mutants. Before in Fallout 4, it was possible to hurt super mutants even though they had radiation immunity, and that was because of the radiation damage component. It still does a good amount of damage and has the small area of effect mechanic, although that does no additional explosives damage and is not affected by explosive perks. Once again, this is a decent weapon that can be pretty powerful against the right enemies depending on the perk loadout. Looking at the aesthetics, nothing seems securely attached and is just a bunch of exposed electronics. The body of the gun shows exposed circuit boards with all sorts of capacitors, resistors, and leads visible to the player, and to all the elements. You better hope that it never rains, or that you never have to fight where it is wet and dirty, because there is no way this weapon is durable enough to survive anything more than the most basic elements. I was happy to see that a radiation firing weapon was finally included in the series, although I had not imagined it to fire this ultra visible wave of energy, and had actually wondered if a radiation type of gun could be used to stealthily kill or assassinate characters, as they would die over the course of a day or two from radiation poisoning. This weapon also makes fights with the Children of Adam super chaotic, since the visible waves can block the screen really easily, especially if there are multiple people with gamma guns all firing at the same time. It makes for some seriously frantic firefights and is, in my opinion, one of the coolest new weapon types that was introduced in Fallout 4. Let's end this list with one of my all-time favorite weapons, if you want to call it that, and that is the Mesmetron from Fallout 3. I can't tell you how many hours I spent testing it on as many characters as I could to see who was enslavable and who wasn't, and it provided endless joy to see what effects this weapon had on my unfortunate victims. Developed by Implied Hypnotics Incorporated, which is a fantastic name by the way, it only featured in Fallout 3. It's a very strange looking weapon, essentially being a TV looking device attached to a handle that can be held like a pistol. Although with all that weight in the front, it would be ridiculously front heavy. The Mesmetron is received from Gauss at Paradise Falls, who gives it to the player on the condition that the player shoot unsuspecting people, otherwise known as mezzing, and turning them into slaves. Having scavenged it from a nearby military base, this is the only one available in the whole game, so it was not in widespread use. The effects of the Mesmetron can vary from passively subduing a target, causing them to get dizzy and very suggestible, which in turn can lead to you putting a slave collar on them or ordering them to give you all their stuff, which they happily do. Alternatively, it can cause an otherwise non-aggressive NPC to aggro and frenzy, engaging the player and surrounding NPCs, although you'll want to switch to an actual weapon because the Mesmetron does exactly 1 hit point of damage. The last potential effect is the most visually spectacular, as it can, to quote the user guide that comes with the weapon from Gauss, cause a resonant brainwave feedback loop that causes the brain to undergo explosive cranial deformation. In other words, their heads blow up. The Mesmetron is only capable of using so-called Mesmetron energy cells, which are exactly like the small energy cells with some coloring differences. This keeps the ammo in short supply, as it can only be obtained from Gauss at a price of 200 caps for 10 cells, so killing him will effectively dry up that supply. There is no other place in the base game where the cells can be found, and it isn't until Point Lookout in the underground cave where Calvert's brain resides that the player can find any more. Although after all these have been looted, that's it. The firing animation shows a fast traveling blue wave that impacts the target, causing one of the aforementioned effects. There are a few things you can do to increase the chances of successfully mezzing someone. Shooting while hidden from the target can increase the chances of a successful mezz if you are interested in subduing the target, as well as aiming for the head and attacking in VATS. This is no guarantee though, and if the NPC is associated with a quest, or even named in some cases, you won't be able to subdue them. Instead, they will frenzy or have their heads explosively deform. The chances of making the target frenzy is around 30%, while the cranial eruption has a 20% chance of occurring over just the average aggro. Targeting unarmed people will also increase the chances of a successful mez, and the mysterious stranger will even mind his manners and not fire on the mez subject if he appears in VATS. Because of the myriad of effects this weapon can have and the effects of the mezzing mechanics, there are a number of oddities. Enslaved NPCs have a pretty high chance of dying en route to Paradise Falls, but this can be mitigated if you fast travel to Paradise Falls, although this does not ensure that the slave will survive the trip across the wasteland. However, for whatever reason, raiders have a lower likelihood of surviving the trip to Paradise Falls than other kinds of NPCs. Any generic NPC that is enslaved and successfully arrive at Paradise Falls will not respawn. So if you were to mez all the raiders in a common raider spawn location, the location will remain permanently uninhabited no matter how much time passes. This makes it possible to clear out some locations permanently of spawning enemies. If you enslave a target and remove the slave collar after putting it on, it will make them friendly, even if they are always hostile to the player, like for example, a raider or enclave soldier. They are apparently so grateful for your mercy too that this friendliness persists throughout the game, and they will even attack any NPC that attacks the player character, even if it is their own group. Nothing like a little Stockholm syndrome to turn an enclave soldier against his former squad. Witnesses to a mezzing will sometimes not react at all, although the chances of bystanders not becoming violent are slightly higher when attacking from a hidden position. The Mesmetron itself has a large TV screen-like component that the waves seem to emanate from. It looks pretty trippy when looking directly at it, and it will glow blue, even when using a stealth boy, which you think would negate the whole stealth thing, but it doesn't seem to have an effect. It can be fully invisible though, you just have to have it equipped when the stealth boy takes effect, and it will effectively make the entirety of the weapon invisible. It is obvious that this is not meant as a weapon, given its damage of 1 and critical damage of an amazing 0, although you could, in theory, kill someone with it if you had enough energy cells. The weapon works on the principle of overloading and confusing synaptic relays in the brain, causing the brain to cease normal function. That sounds an awful like the Spasm gun we mentioned before, and the Mesmetron manual even states that motor control is heavily impacted, so it may be argued that this is an evolution of that technology. The only other unique variant is the microwave emitter that was introduced in the Point Lookout add-on. Its origins are unknown, and it is rewarded at the end of a Meeting of the Minds quest and looks exactly like the Mesmetron in every way. It doesn't use the Mesmetron energy cells though. Thankfully, it uses microfusion cells, so it is much easier to supply with ammunition. It does a good amount of energy damage at 60 base attack damage and a ×2 critical multiplier. That is okay as damage goes, but what really makes this special is that it ignores damage resistance, allowing it to fully apply its damage straight to the target regardless of armor. It also has a slight spread upon firing, making it easier to hit targets close up, similar to a shotgun, but also makes it a poor ranged weapon. It is interesting to note that it will not ignite gas leaks from afar, but if fired in the middle of the gas, it will ignite the gas, maybe implying that the wave attenuates too much with distance to properly ignite the gas. The microwave emitter is such a copy of the Mesmetron that even the reload animation is identical, with the player very obviously loading Mesmetron power cells rather than microfusion cells. Much like the Gamma Gun, the microwave emitter implies that the energy fired from the weapon are microwaves. The weapon is particularly effective against robots, which would make sense if it is indeed firing concentrated microwave radiation. Although I find it interesting that it is able to ignore all damage resistance even for power armor. Given that power armor is made of fairly thick pieces of metal, it would be pretty readily absorbed and really should only damage the electronics within the armor rather than the wearer of the armor. Nitpicks aside, it can be a really fun weapon as it can light targets on fire and reduce them to ashes on a critical hit, similar to laser weapons, although the ash pile is more like the ash pile that is made from alien weaponry. Aesthetically, the Mesmetron and microwave emitter are very unique, and the little TV display portion has some hypnotic wave patterns built into it, which is very appropriate. The 3 lights on top never light up, so their function is unknown, and there's a gauge that shows the so-called subliminal level, which is always maxed out when using the weapon. There's a dial below the gauge that may change the so-called subliminal level with a delta and what I think is an omega symbol as well, although it is never adjusted in game and always cranked towards the delta. There is some cool concept art that you can see online, and I kinda wish the grip was more vertically in line with the rest of the weapon since it would be easier to use and aim, but the Mesmetron is already a terrible weapon to aim. Due to not having iron sights in Fallout 3 and the enormous size of the weapon, aiming it will actually obscure your shot, so it is essentially useless unless really close up. I absolutely love the Mesmetron and the microwave emitter, and really miss their inclusion and honestly, the whole slaving mechanic in the following games. I would like to see the mechanic make a return, and having the Mesmetron again would be some good fan service as well. Let me know in the comments if, like me, you spent more time than you probably should have trying to mez everyone you could find. That is the end of this video, but if you didn't see your favorite random energy weapon, don't worry, there will be another video. I won't do you guys dirty, I promise. I also have some good news for you all. I am officially putting together the Rad King Discord. Come join the Discord, and since I am still in the process of spinning it up, give me recommendations for channels and things you would like to see. I will be able to interact with you all much easier this way, and I am very excited. That said, I'm also going through a lot of change right now as I am moving as well as making changes with work, but I am still planning on getting videos out on a regular schedule. Now, on to my comment highlights. My last video was dedicated solely to the T-51 power armor, and it had a lot of great comments. In mentioning that the T-51 is featured in all games except for Tactics and Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, one of you sharp-eyed fans reminded me that technically it is seen in Fallout Tactics. NemFX reminded me that the intro to Fallout Tactics shows T-51 power armor, so technically it is shown in Fallout Tactics. It is just not playable. But you know what I like to say, technically correct is the best kind of correct. Zaonic Fenrir commented on the T-51B set of armor that can be found in Fort Constantine in Fallout 3 as a reward for completing Gotta Shoot 'em in the Head. I had said that I thought it was interesting that it was behind the stasis field and wondered what made this T-51B so special. The terminal beside the armor that is used to disable the stasis field mentions that the armor being stored in the stasis field is the medic prototype armor and not the T-51B. So this could be a last minute change on the part of Bethesda, which I think is the most likely. Or there was a Brotherhood of Steel member that got to the prototype armor first and left his T-51 in its stead. You find the prototype medic power armor under Old Only on a dead Brotherhood of Steel member, but this explanation is problematic because Fort Constantine seems like it has not been infiltrated with the exception of the mercenary team that was meant to recover the armor. Many of you offered great theories for why the Enclave power armor in Fallout 3 was so inferior compared to the advanced power armor of Fallout 2 when compared to T-51 armor, and even T-45. Most of them went along the same lines, that the Enclave were on the ropes after the destruction of the oil rig, and that their manufacturing abilities were probably greatly diminished. They were forced to reinvent a new armor that they could reproduce in sufficient quantities with limited resources and capabilities. And for that reason, the Advanced Power Armor Mark III and Hellfire were not so staggeringly superior to T-51. I think this is as good of an answer as I have ever heard to explain this discrepancy, and even if it isn't the official lore, it is my new headcanon. Sanguinius on Vacation wrote this great comment. Honestly, if Bethesda had written this into their game as official lore, I would have no problem with it. As it stands, we are left to speculate and try and justify things within the Fallout universe that may have answers that lie outside of the universe. This isn't unique to this franchise, but is a universal issue regarding media franchises in general. Taxman talked about the hardening process in Fallout and Fallout 2 in regards to T-51, and brought up a great point. In the military, the term itself doesn't necessarily mean literal hardening, but rather a range of potential upgrades that is meant to increase the effectiveness of a piece of military hardware. We know for sure there is a chemical process involved since one of the requirements is to provide Miles with the necessary chemistry books, but is that all that's involved? It's hard to say. The sprite itself doesn't change at all, but that doesn't necessarily mean it couldn't have upgraded hardware itself. Often the upgraded items in the early Fallouts don't have new sprites to show the upgraded features, and this is likely a resource restraint on the part of the developers rather than a statement of the item itself. A few of you also offered good speculation related to why there are next to no suits of T-51B in the Capital Wasteland. There were good suggestions like this from Nate James that talked about how the National Guard in DC may have had T-45 issued to them and no other kind of power armor, meaning that all other types are rare or non-existent. We know that Bethesda will give certain power armor types to certain groups, like the Secret Service having access to T-65 in Fallout 76. So it is definitely within the realm of possibility that something like this would justify the lack of T-51 in DC. When speaking on the well-worn topic of T-51B having a damage threshold of 2,500 joules of energy, literally FF mentioned that maybe it was meant to describe how much energy on a given area. Really, that would mean we are talking about pressure, since force is divided by area, but it could mean the difference between being strong enough to resist the kinds of rounds one would expect in a war situation and not being able to. If, for example, it is 2,500 joules of energy per millimeter squared versus 2,500 joules of energy per centimeter squared. This is certainly a possibility. We are now at the end of the video, but not all is lost because our strength is in atom. Take care of yourselves, and I'll be back in 2 weeks with another video.